The Amsterdam News Building stood at 2348th Avenue in Harlem, between West 135th and West 136th Streets. The newspaper had been operating since 1909, and by September 1948 had established itself as one of the most important black newspapers in America, with a circulation exceeding 100,000 copies weekly. The building housed not only the newspaper's editorial and printing operations, but also commercial office space that was rented to various businesses and professional services. The ground floor featured storefronts that opened directly onto 8th Avenue, creating visibility and foot traffic that made these spaces valuable for retail establishments. On the afternoon of September 18th, 1948, at approximately 2:30, Ellsworth Raymond Johnson entered the Amsterdam News Building and walked to the fourth-floor offices of the building's property management company. Johnson was 42 years old, dressed in a dark gray suit with a white shirt and a conservative tie. He had been operating Harlem's numbers rackets for more than a decade, maintaining independent control while paying 15% of profits to the Italian mob families. Johnson's position in Harlem combined criminal authority with significant community involvement. He was known for supporting local businesses, paying funeral expenses for families in need, contributing to churches and community organizations, and generally being integrated into Harlem's social and economic life in ways that extended beyond his gambling operations. Johnson's visit to the property management office that afternoon concerned a specific business matter. Johnson had learned that one of the ground-floor storefronts in the Amsterdam News Building was becoming available in October when the current tenant's lease expired. The space was approximately 1,500 square feet, with large windows facing 8th Avenue, making it ideal for retail use. Johnson wanted to secure this space for a restaurant that would be operated by one of his associates. The restaurant would serve as a legitimate business providing employment and services to the community, but it would also function as a collection point for numbers operations, allowing runners to deliver receipts and for customers to place bets in a location that appeared to be an ordinary commercial establishment. Johnson met with Martin Henderson, who managed the Amsterdam News Building's commercial properties. Henderson was 51 years old, white, and had worked in commercial real estate management in New York for more than 20 years. Henderson had moved to managing the Amsterdam News properties 3 years earlier, in 1945, and had approached his work with assumptions about how business should be conducted in Harlem that reflected his experience in predominantly white commercial districts, rather than understanding of Harlem's particular dynamics. Johnson explained to Henderson that he wanted to lease the ground-floor storefront for a restaurant operation. Johnson stated that his associate, David Mitchell, would be the named lessee and would operate the restaurant, but that Johnson would guarantee the lease payments and would ensure that the space was maintained properly. Johnson proposed a 3-year lease with rent of $300 monthly, which was consistent with what other ground-floor commercial spaces in the building commanded. Henderson listened to Johnson's proposal and then stated that he would need to review Mitchell's financial qualifications and business experience before approving any lease. Henderson asked Johnson to provide financial statements, bank references, and a detailed business plan showing how the restaurant would generate sufficient revenue to cover rent and operating expenses. And Henderson's tone was businesslike, but also carried an edge of dismissiveness. He spoke to Johnson the way a property manager might speak to any prospective tenant who had not yet proven their credit worthiness, without acknowledgment of Johnson's actual position in Harlem or of the fact that Johnson's guarantee carried weight that formal financial statements could not capture. Johnson replied calmly that Mitchell had restaurant experience and that the business plan would show the restaurant could operate profitably. Johnson emphasized again that he personally would guarantee all lease payments and that Henderson could be confident the rent would be paid consistently and on time. Henderson responded that personal guarantees were not sufficient for commercial leases of this nature, that proper documentation was required, and that the approval process would take several weeks, while Henderson reviewed the application and conducted due diligence on Mitchell's qualifications. Johnson stated that he understood Henderson had procedures to follow, but that the situation might be simpler than Henderson was making it. Johnson explained that many businesses in Harlem operated through arrangements that might not conform to standard commercial lending or leasing practices, but that functioned effectively based on community relationships and on the reputations of the people involved. Johnson suggested that Henderson might find it useful to make inquiries within Harlem about whether Johnson's guarantee was reliable rather than focusing solely on formal documentation. Henderson's expression shifted from businesslike formality to something closer to annoyance, and he stated that he did not conduct business based on neighborhood reputations or informal arrangements. He stated that the Amsterdam News Building maintained professional standards for its commercial tenants and that these standards applied equally to all prospective lessees, regardless of who they knew or what their standing in the community might be. Henderson stated that if Johnson and Mitchell wanted to lease the space, they would need to provide the documentation he had requested and would need to wait for the approval process to be completed. If they were unwilling or unable to meet these requirements, Henderson would consider other applicants for the space. Johnson remained silent for several seconds, looking at Henderson with an expression that showed neither anger nor concern. And then Johnson stated that he appreciated Henderson explaining the requirements clearly. Johnson said he would discuss the matter with Mitchell and would be in touch with Henderson within the next few days. Johnson stood, thanked Henderson for his time, and left the office. Johnson walked from the Amsterdam News Building south on 8th Avenue toward 125th Street. His outward demeanor remained completely calm. He maintained his usual measured pace, nodded to people he encountered, and gave no indication of frustration or displeasure. But Johnson's mind worked systematically through what had just occurred and through what it revealed about how Henderson approached business in Harlem and how Henderson viewed Johnson specifically. Henderson had treated Johnson the way a property manager might treat any unknown individual making an inquiry about commercial space, with professional courtesy, but with no recognition of Johnson's actual position, no acknowledgement that Johnson's word carried value, and no apparent awareness that dismissing Johnson's proposal might create complications. Henderson had adopted a stance of formal procedure and documented qualification, apparently believing that insisting on standard commercial practices would protect him from any pressure or influence that Johnson might attempt to bring to bear. This stance revealed several things about Henderson that Johnson found strategically useful. First, Henderson clearly did not understand how power actually operated in Harlem. Henderson believed that his formal authority as property manager and his control over lease approvals gave him decisive power in the situation. Henderson believed that requiring documentation and following procedures would allow him to make decisions based purely on business criteria without regard to Johnson's community position or to the potential consequences of refusing Johnson's request. Second, Henderson apparently believed that the Amsterdam News Building's association with one of Harlem's most respected institutions provided protection from the kinds of pressure that might affect other commercial properties. The Amsterdam News was more than a newspaper. It was a political voice, a cultural institution, and a symbol of black achievement and self-determination. Henderson seemed to think that this institutional standing created a buffer that would prevent anyone, including Johnson, from taking actions that might harm the newspaper or its property. Third, Henderson had treated Johnson with thinly veiled condescension, speaking to him as though Johnson were simply another prospective tenant who needed to prove his qualifications, rather than someone whose position in Harlem demanded respect and careful consideration. This condescension suggested that Henderson viewed Johnson primarily as a criminal figure whose influence was limited to illegal activities and who could be safely dismissed when attempting to engage in legitimate business transactions. All three of these misunderstandings created opportunity for Johnson. Henderson's misreading of the situation meant that Henderson would be unprepared for the response that Johnson would implement. Henderson would discover that formal authority provided less protection than he assumed, that the Amsterdam News's institutional standing did not insulate Henderson personally from consequences, and that dismissing Johnson had been a costly error in judgment. Johnson understood that responding to Henderson's dismissal required a strategic approach that would demonstrate several things simultaneously. Johnson needed to show that he could create serious problems for Henderson through multiple channels, that these problems would accumulate to make Henderson's position untenable, and that cooperating with Johnson would be easier and more beneficial than continuing to insist on formal procedures. Johnson also needed to ensure that his response was measured and strategic rather than emotional or violent, because the goal was not to destroy Henderson, but to compel Henderson to recognize Johnson's actual position and to operate accordingly in the future. Over the weekend following the meeting with Henderson, Johnson began building a coalition and developing a strategy. The first ally was Reverend David Licorice, assistant pastor at Abyssinian Baptist Church, who had worked with Johnson on various community matters over the years. Johnson met with Reverend Licorice on Saturday afternoon and explained that he was attempting to lease commercial space for a restaurant, but that the property manager was requiring extensive documentation that seemed designed to create obstacles rather than to assess the viability of the business. Johnson asked whether Reverend Licorice knew Martin Henderson or had any information about Henderson's standing in the community. Reverend Licorice replied that he knew of Henderson but had not worked with him directly. Licorice stated that Henderson had a reputation for being difficult to work with and for treating Harlem businesses and community organizations with less respect than he showed to white-owned enterprises. Several church members had complained about Henderson's management of the Amsterdam News Building, stating that Henderson was quick to enforce lease terms against black tenants, but was slow to address building maintenance issues or to respond to tenant concerns. Reverend Licorice agreed to speak with other community leaders about Henderson and to gather information about whether Henderson's management was creating broader problems beyond Johnson's specific situation. The second ally was Eleanor Washington, an attorney who handled legal matters for several Harlem businesses and who had represented Johnson on various occasions when legal issues arose concerning his gambling operations or his legitimate business interests. Johnson met with Washington on Sunday morning and explained Henderson's requirement for extensive financial documentation and Henderson's dismissal of Johnson's personal guarantee. Johnson asked Washington to research what documentation was actually required under New York law for commercial leases and whether Henderson had legal grounds to impose requirements beyond what the law mandated. Washington conducted research and reported back that commercial property managers had substantial discretion in selecting tenants and in setting qualification requirements, but that these requirements needed to be applied consistently across all applicants. If Henderson was requiring more extensive documentation from Johnson and Mitchell than he required from other prospective tenants, this could constitute discriminatory treatment. Washington agreed to prepare a formal letter to Henderson, raising questions about whether his requirements were being applied consistently and whether his approach complied with fair housing and commercial leasing regulations. The third ally was James Morrison, who managed an extensive network of informants and sources throughout Harlem, and who provided Johnson with intelligence about various activities, movements, and developments in the neighborhood. Johnson asked Morrison to gather information about Henderson specifically: where Henderson lived, how he commuted to work, what his routines were, whether he had any business interests beyond managing the Amsterdam News Building, and whether he had any vulnerabilities that might create pressure if Johnson chose to apply it. Morrison's network gathered information quickly. By Monday morning, Morrison reported that Henderson lived in a middle-class neighborhood in Queens, commuted to Harlem by subway, typically arrived at the Amsterdam News Building around 8:30 each morning and left around 5:30 each evening. Henderson had no other business interests that Morrison's sources could identify. Henderson's financial situation appeared stable but not wealthy. He lived modestly and appeared to depend entirely on his salary from managing the Amsterdam News properties. The fourth ally was a coalition of approximately 15 Harlem business owners who leased commercial space in the Amsterdam News Building or in other properties Henderson managed. Johnson contacted several business owners he knew personally and explained that Henderson was creating obstacles for a restaurant lease, and that Henderson's approach reflected broader patterns of disrespectful treatment toward Harlem businesses. Johnson asked whether other tenants had experienced similar problems with Henderson's management. Multiple business owners confirmed that Henderson was difficult to work with. Several described situations where Henderson had been slow to approve lease modifications that would have allowed businesses to expand or to make improvements. Others described Henderson ignoring maintenance requests for weeks or months, while being quick to send notices about late rent payments or lease violations. Several business owners stated that they believed Henderson treated them differently than he would have treated white tenants in other buildings he might have managed before coming to Harlem. Johnson proposed that these business owners could collectively communicate their concerns to the Amsterdam News's ownership and editorial leadership, making clear that Henderson's management style was creating problems for Harlem businesses and was reflecting poorly on the newspaper's relationship with the community it served. The business owners agreed to coordinate their complaints and to document specific instances where Henderson's management had been inadequate or discriminatory. With allies identified and initial information gathered, Johnson developed a multi-layered strategy designed to create pressure on Henderson from several directions simultaneously. The strategy would demonstrate that Henderson's dismissal of Johnson had consequences beyond the specific lease transaction, that Henderson's position depended on relationships he had damaged through his approach to management, and that cooperating with Johnson would resolve problems while continuing resistance would escalate them. The first layer of pressure was legal and procedural. On Monday, September 20th, attorney Eleanor Washington sent a formal letter to Henderson raising questions about whether his documentation requirements were being applied consistently across all prospective tenants. The letter noted that New York's fair housing and commercial leasing regulations prohibited discriminatory treatment and requested that Henderson provide information about what documentation he had required from other applicants for commercial space in the building over the previous year. The letter stated that if Henderson could not demonstrate consistent application of requirements, Washington's client would consider filing a formal complaint with the New York State Commission Against Discrimination. Henderson received this letter on Tuesday morning and immediately recognized it as escalation beyond the simple lease inquiry Johnson had made. Henderson contacted the Amsterdam News's attorney to discuss how to respond. The attorney advised that Henderson should document his standard requirements for commercial leases and should be prepared to show that he had applied these requirements consistently. The attorney also warned that discrimination complaints could create publicity problems for the Amsterdam News, even if the complaints ultimately proved unfounded. The second layer of pressure was community and institutional. Over Tuesday and Wednesday, approximately 15 business owners who leased space in Henderson's properties contacted the Amsterdam News's publisher and editor to lodge complaints about Henderson's management. The complaints were coordinated but varied in their specific content. Some focused on maintenance issues, others on Henderson's communication style, others on approval processes for lease modifications. The cumulative effect was to create the impression that Henderson's management was generating widespread dissatisfaction among the building's tenants. The publisher, C.B. Powell, was initially skeptical about these complaints, suspecting they might be orchestrated. But when Powell spoke with the business owners individually, he heard consistent accounts of Henderson treating Harlem businesses with less respect and attention than their rent payments and long-term tenancy deserved. Powell began to question whether Henderson was the right person to manage properties associated with Harlem's most important newspaper. The third layer of pressure was economic and operational. Starting on Wednesday, September 22nd, several of Henderson's tenants began experiencing problems that required Henderson's immediate attention. A plumbing issue in one tenant's space created water damage that needed emergency repair. An electrical problem in another space created fire hazards that required immediate inspection. A dispute between two adjacent tenants about noise levels required Henderson to mediate. These problems were real, but their timing was coordinated. Johnson had arranged through his network for issues to surface simultaneously in ways that would consume Henderson's time and attention, while demonstrating that Henderson's position depended on maintaining functional relationships with tenants who could make his job either manageable or impossible. The fourth layer of pressure was reputational and social. Word began circulating in Harlem that Henderson had insulted Bumpy Johnson by treating him disrespectfully during a business meeting. But the word spread through barbershops, restaurants, social clubs, and informal networks. The story was not exaggerated. It simply stated that Henderson had refused to accept Johnson's personal guarantee for a lease and had treated Johnson as though he were an unqualified applicant who needed to prove himself. For many Harlem residents who understood Johnson's actual position, Henderson's treatment of Johnson seemed remarkably foolish and suggested that Henderson did not understand the community he was working in. This reputational damage affected Henderson in subtle but meaningful ways. When Henderson walked through Harlem during his lunch breaks or when commuting to and from work, he noticed that people looked at him differently. Some expressions showed amusement. People seemed to find it entertaining that Henderson had made such an obvious mistake. Other expressions showed something closer to concern. People seemed to wonder whether Henderson understood how much trouble he had created for himself. No one threatened Henderson or spoke to him disrespectfully. The pressure was entirely atmospheric, but it was real and it was accumulating. By Thursday afternoon, September 23rd, Henderson was dealing with multiple problems simultaneously. He was preparing a response to Attorney Washington's letter while trying to document that his leasing requirements had been applied consistently. He was addressing tenant complaints and maintenance emergencies that seemed to be arising with unusual frequency. But he was hearing from the Amsterdam News's publisher that questions were being raised about his management competence. And he was experiencing social discomfort in Harlem that made his daily work environment unpleasant in ways he could not quite identify or address. On Friday morning, September 24th, Henderson received a phone call from Reverend Licorice, who stated that he was calling on behalf of several community leaders who had concerns about Henderson's management of the Amsterdam News building. Reverend Licorice explained that the community valued the Amsterdam News as an institution and wanted to ensure that the building's commercial properties were managed in ways that supported Harlem businesses and that reflected well on the newspaper's commitment to the community. Reverend Licorice stated that several business owners and community figures had raised concerns about Henderson's approach, and that these concerns needed to be addressed before they escalated into more serious problems. Henderson listened and stated that he believed he was managing the building professionally and that any tenant complaints were isolated incidents. Reverend Licorice replied gently that the pattern of complaints suggested otherwise and that Henderson might benefit from reconsidering his approach to certain matters, including the restaurant lease that Johnson had inquired about. Reverend Licorice stated that Johnson was a respected community figure whose word was reliable and whose business proposals deserved serious consideration rather than bureaucratic obstacles. This call clarified for Henderson that the pressure he was experiencing was not coincidental. Johnson had orchestrated a coordinated response that operated through multiple channels: legal, institutional, economic, operational, reputational, and social. Henderson recognized that this response demonstrated sophisticated organizational capacity and that continuing to resist Johnson's lease proposal would likely result in continued and possibly intensified pressure. Henderson spent Friday afternoon and weekend considering his situation, He understood now that his initial assessment of the lease inquiry had been based on fundamental misunderstanding of Johnson's actual position in Harlem. Henderson had treated the inquiry as a routine commercial transaction where formal procedures would determine the outcome. Johnson had demonstrated that commercial transactions in Harlem operated within social and political contexts that Henderson had failed to understand, and that ignoring those contexts created problems that formal authority could not resolve. Henderson also recognized that Johnson's response had been calibrated carefully. Nothing illegal had occurred. No threats, no violence, no explicit coercion. Instead, Johnson had mobilized legitimate concerns about Henderson's management, had raised valid questions about discriminatory treatment, had coordinated tenant issues that required Henderson's attention, and had allowed information to circulate that damaged Henderson's reputation without exaggeration or falsehood. This calibration meant that Henderson had no obvious recourse through law enforcement or through formal complaints. Henderson's problems were real, but were the result of Johnson working strategically within systems rather than outside them. On Monday morning, September 27th, 1 week after his initial meeting with Johnson, Henderson prepared a proposal to present to Johnson as a way of resolving the situation. Henderson planned to offer to approve the lease with reduced documentation requirements and with acknowledgement that Johnson's personal guarantee would be accepted as adequate security. Henderson scheduled this proposal for a meeting he would request with Johnson later that week, giving both parties time to discuss terms and to reach a mutually acceptable resolution. But before Henderson could contact Johnson to request a meeting, Johnson walked into Henderson's office at approximately 10 o'clock Monday morning. Johnson's arrival was unexpected. No appointment had been scheduled. Johnson's demeanor was calm and businesslike, showing no indication of anger or satisfaction at the pressure campaign he had orchestrated over the previous week. Johnson stated that he wanted to follow up on their previous discussion about the restaurant lease. Johnson said he understood that Henderson needed to follow certain procedures, but that perhaps they could find an approach that would satisfy Henderson's requirements while allowing the lease to move forward in a timely manner. Johnson's tone suggested that he was offering to be reasonable rather than insisting on immediate capitulation. Henderson recognized that Johnson was providing an opportunity for Henderson to adjust his position without explicitly acknowledging that he had been forced to do so. And Henderson stated that upon further review of the lease proposal and of Mitchell's qualifications, he believed the documentation concerns could be addressed through a somewhat simplified process. Henderson proposed that if Mitchell could provide basic business references and if Johnson would provide a written personal guarantee, Henderson would be prepared to approve a 3-year lease at $300 monthly rent, with the lease to begin October 1st, when the current tenant vacated. Johnson replied that this approach seemed reasonable and that Mitchell would provide the references Henderson requested. Johnson then stated that he would like to add one element to the arrangement. He wanted Henderson to have 24 hours to confirm whether this proposal was actually acceptable or whether Henderson needed to consider it further before committing. Johnson stated that he wanted to ensure Henderson had time to verify that his employer and his attorney were comfortable with the proposed approach, and that he wanted to avoid any situation where Henderson agreed to terms, but then needed to modify them later because of concerns raised by others. This offer of additional time was strategic. By giving Henderson 24 hours to confirm the arrangement, Johnson was creating a formal structure for Henderson's capitulation that transformed what might appear to be immediate surrender into what could be presented as thoughtful business decision-making. Johnson was allowing Henderson to maintain dignity while ensuring that Henderson would think carefully about whether to honor the agreement before confirming it. The 24-hour window also created a deadline that would focus Henderson's attention and would prevent indefinite delay. Henderson understood what Johnson was doing. The offer of time was simultaneously generous and controlling. It gave Henderson space to make his decision while making clear that the decision needed to be made definitively within a specific time frame. Henderson also understood that the pressure he had experienced over the previous week would not simply disappear if he failed to confirm the arrangement within 24 hours. If anything, declining to confirm would likely result in renewed and possibly intensified pressure. Henderson stated that he appreciated Johnson's consideration in providing time to confirm the arrangement, but that Henderson did not need 24 hours. Henderson stated that he had already consulted with the Amsterdam News's attorney and with the publisher, and that both had indicated they were comfortable with accepting Johnson's personal guarantee as adequate security for the lease. Henderson stated that he was prepared to confirm immediately that he would approve the lease on the terms they had just discussed, with Mitchell providing basic business references and with Johnson providing a written personal guarantee. Johnson looked at Henderson for several seconds without speaking. The silence was not hostile, but it was weighty. Johnson was allowing Henderson to feel the significance of what Henderson had just said. By confirming immediately rather than using the full 24 hours, Henderson was acknowledging explicitly that he understood Johnson's position and that he had made a definitive choice to cooperate rather than to continue resisting. Johnson stated that he was pleased Henderson felt comfortable moving forward without delay and that he looked forward to the restaurant opening in October. Johnson said he would have Mitchell contact Henderson that afternoon to provide the business references and to review the lease terms. Johnson thanked Henderson for his time and left the office. The entire exchange had taken approximately 10 minutes from when Johnson entered Henderson's office to when he departed. Henderson had been given 24 hours to decide whether to approve the lease arrangement, but had confirmed his approval within 10 minutes of Johnson presenting the proposal. This rapid decision represented complete reversal from Henderson's position 9 days earlier, when he had dismissed Johnson's initial inquiry and had insisted on extensive documentation and lengthy approval processes. The restaurant lease was finalized within 2 weeks. David Mitchell signed a 3-year lease for the ground floor storefront, Johnson provided a written personal guarantee, and the restaurant opened for business in early November 1948. The restaurant operated successfully throughout its lease term, paying rent consistently and creating no management problems for Henderson. The restaurant also functioned effectively as a collection point for numbers operations, allowing Johnson's organization to conduct business in a location that appeared entirely legitimate. The immediate outcome of the lease arrangement was straightforward. Johnson secured the commercial space he wanted and demonstrated that he could overcome bureaucratic obstacles through strategic pressure. But the deeper significance of the episode related to what it revealed about power dynamics in Harlem and about how underestimation could be converted into strategic advantage. Henderson's initial dismissal of Johnson had been based on fundamental misunderstanding about where power resided. And Henderson had believed that his formal authority as property manager gave him control over lease approvals and that following standard procedures would protect him from any pressure Johnson might apply. Henderson learned that formal authority provided less protection than he assumed, and that power in Harlem operated through networks of relationships, community standing, and capacity to mobilize multiple forms of pressure simultaneously. The episode also demonstrated principles about strategic response to disrespect. Johnson had not reacted emotionally to Henderson's dismissive treatment. Johnson had not threatened Henderson or attempted to intimidate him during their initial meeting. Instead, Johnson had walked away quietly and had spent the following week building a coalition, gathering information, and implementing a multi-layered pressure campaign that made Henderson's position increasingly untenable. This strategic patience created more powerful effects than immediate confrontation would have achieved, because it demonstrated organizational capacity and because it created pressures that Henderson could not easily resist or deflect. Most significantly, the episode illustrated how offering apparent generosity at the moment of victory could serve strategic purposes. Johnson's offer to give Henderson 24 hours to confirm the lease arrangement appeared to be considerate and respectful of Henderson's need to consult with others before committing. But the offer also created a formal structure that transformed Henderson's capitulation into what could be presented as thoughtful business decision-making. By allowing Henderson to maintain dignity while ensuring Henderson understood the situation clearly, Johnson achieved his objective while creating a template for how Henderson should approach future interactions with Johnson, with respect and with understanding that cooperation served both parties' interests better than bureaucratic resistance. Henderson's decision to confirm the arrangement within 10 minutes rather than using the full 24 hours was equally strategic. Henderson recognized that delaying his confirmation would not change the underlying dynamics and might create impression that Henderson was still resisting or was reluctant to honor his commitment. By confirming immediately, Henderson signaled that he understood the situation, accepted Johnson's position, and would operate accordingly in the future. This rapid confirmation transformed what might have been perceived as humiliating surrender into what could be presented as efficient business decision-making by someone who recognized a good proposal when he saw it. Over the following years, Henderson's management of the Amsterdam News building improved noticeably. Henderson became more responsive to tenant concerns, processed lease modifications more quickly, addressed maintenance issues more proactively, and generally treated Harlem businesses with greater respect and consideration. This improvement was partly the result of pressure from the Amsterdam News's leadership, who had received complaints from multiple tenants and who had made clear to Henderson that his management needed to better reflect the newspaper's commitment to the community. But the improvement was also the result of Henderson's recognition that his position depended on maintaining functional relationships with tenants and with community figures, and that dismissive or disrespectful treatment could create serious problems. The restaurant that opened in the Amsterdam News building operated successfully for more than 15 years. It became a neighborhood institution where Harlem residents gathered for meals, where community meetings were sometimes held, and where various forms of neighborhood business, both legitimate and otherwise, were conducted. The restaurant's success validated Johnson's original proposal and demonstrated that his assessment of the location's commercial potential had been sound. The restaurant also served as a visible reminder to Henderson and to others that Johnson's business proposals deserved serious consideration, and that attempting to obstruct Johnson through bureaucratic procedures was both ineffective and counterproductive. For the broader Harlem community, the episode became part of the collective understanding about how Johnson operated and about what made him effective. People appreciated that Johnson had not responded to Henderson's disrespect with violence or with threats, but had instead mobilized community support, legal pressure, and strategic coordination to achieve his objective. This approach reinforced Johnson's reputation as someone who understood power in sophisticated ways and who could accomplish things through organization and strategy rather than through force alone. The episode also illustrated patterns about how black business owners and community figures navigated relationships with white managers and administrators who controlled access to commercial space, capital, and other resources. Henderson's initial dismissiveness reflected assumptions that were common among white professionals who worked in black neighborhoods, assumptions that formal procedures and documented qualifications should determine outcomes without regard to community standing or social relationships. Johnson's successful response to this dismissiveness demonstrated that community power could overcome bureaucratic obstacles when that power was mobilized strategically and when it operated through multiple channels simultaneously. For other property managers and business administrators working in Harlem, and the episode provided a cautionary example about the costs of underestimating community figures or of treating them disrespectfully. Henderson's experience became known within certain circles, creating awareness that figures like Johnson possessed capabilities that extended beyond their criminal operations, and that dismissing their proposals or treating them with condescension could create serious complications. This awareness did not mean that property managers capitulated to every request from powerful community figures. It meant that managers approached such requests with greater care and with recognition that the people making them operated within networks that could generate meaningful pressure if necessary. On the lesson that Henderson learned, that formal authority provided less protection than he had assumed, and that community power could overcome bureaucratic obstacles, was a lesson that applied broadly to how institutions operated in Harlem. Schools, hospitals, government agencies, commercial enterprises, and various other institutions all depended partly on maintaining functional relationships with community leaders and with residents. When institutional representatives treated the community disrespectfully or ignored community concerns, they created vulnerability that could be exploited by those who understood how to mobilize community response effectively. And the specific mechanism that Johnson had used, giving Henderson 24 hours to decide, but receiving Henderson's decision within 10 minutes, became a reference point for understanding strategic patience and for understanding how apparent generosity could serve tactical purposes. People who knew the story appreciated that Johnson had offered time to Henderson, not because Johnson doubted the outcome, but because offering time transformed immediate capitulation into what could be presented as thoughtful decision-making. They also appreciated that Henderson's rapid decision demonstrated that Henderson understood the situation clearly and chose to resolve it quickly rather than prolonging uncertainty. This understanding of strategic generosity influenced how Johnson approached other situations throughout the remainder of his career. Johnson recognized that victories achieved while allowing opponents to maintain dignity were often more durable than victories achieved through humiliation. When opponents could present their capitulation as reasonable business decisions or as recognition of mutual interests rather than as surrender to force, they were less likely to seek revenge or to undermine agreements once immediate pressure subsided. Johnson's willingness to provide Henderson with apparent choice about timing, even though the outcome was predetermined, exemplified this principle and illustrated sophisticated understanding of how power could be exercised effectively while preserving relationships that had ongoing value. Martin Henderson continued managing the Amsterdam News Building until his retirement in 1961. During his remaining years in that position, and Henderson maintained cooperative relationships with Johnson and with other Harlem community figures, Henderson never publicly acknowledged that he had been pressured to approve Johnson's restaurant lease, or that the experience had changed his approach to property management. But people who worked with Henderson after September 1948 noted that he seemed more cautious about dismissing proposals from community figures and more attentive to the social context in which commercial transactions in Harlem occurred. When Bumpy Johnson died in July 1968, Henderson had been retired for 7 years but still lived in Queens and still followed Harlem news. Henderson read Johnson's obituary in the Amsterdam News and read accounts of the thousands of people who attended Johnson's funeral. The obituaries described Johnson as a complex figure, a criminal certainly, but also a community leader who had provided assistance to many Harlem residents and who had maintained a sophisticated understanding of power dynamics that allowed him to operate with relative independence for decades. Henderson remembered his interactions with Johnson, including the episode in September 1948, when Johnson had given him 24 hours to approve a lease arrangement, and Henderson had confirmed his approval within 10 minutes. Henderson understood that the episode had taught him important lessons about power, about community dynamics in Harlem, and about the limitations of formal authority when divorced from social relationships and community respect. At the speed with which Henderson had made his decision, abandoning within 10 minutes a position he had held firmly just 9 days earlier, remained in Henderson's memory as an indicator of how completely he had misunderstood the situation initially and how clearly Johnson's response had illuminated the actual dynamics at work. The episode's lasting significance related to its illustration of how strategic patience and sophisticated pressure created more effective power than emotional reaction or visible force. Johnson had been dismissed and disrespected by Henderson, but had responded by building coalitions, gathering information, implementing coordinated pressure through multiple channels, and ultimately offering apparent generosity that allowed Henderson to capitulate with dignity. And this approach achieved Johnson's objective while establishing patterns for future interactions and while demonstrating capabilities that reinforced Johnson's position in Harlem. The contrast between the 24 hours Johnson offered and the 10 minutes Henderson needed to decide encapsulated the episode's essential dynamic. Strategic pressure had created conditions where the outcome was predetermined, but where the process preserved relationships and established templates for cooperation that served both parties' interests over time.